Hi there. This book review is on my latest book, The Battles of King Arthur by Pen and Sword. Now this is an investigation into the 12 battles listed in the Historia Brittonum, famous 12 battles, last of which is the Battle of Badon, which we know is an historical battle as it's cited in other sources, both Gildas and Bede. So we know that one battle is definitely historical, whilst they don't actually attribute it to Arthur, but another source, the Welsh Annals, do. So the book starts going through the historical background. So there's a little bit about the Roman Empire, a little bit about what sort of structures were left over from that, and the beginning of the 5th century. So it sets the scene by talking about the fragmenting provincial and diocese structure. We know that survived for perhaps at least a generation, whilst the economy was deteriorating and de-urbanisation was occurring even before we started to begin to get evidence for increased Germanic migration. So one of the central themes is the changing cultural identity. So we find that over between say 400 and 600, the people of the West and the North of Britain developed a Romano-British Brittonic identity, whereas the people in the East and the South East developed a more, well, I would call it a Germanic identity, but this evolved later into Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So we start off with a provincial structure surviving into the early 5th century. Within 150 to 200 years, we've got the emergence of these petty kingdoms, and an historical Arthur lived right in the middle of this period on the cusp of this change. So that's quite interesting. He's also on the cusp of a changing culture from sort of a Romano urban culture, and it's more of a warband culture developed. So it's interesting where you put him, because an earlier Arthur, the more he's living in a world with surviving Roman institutions. The later Arthur is placed in that period, the more he's in a petty kingdom, warband, localised war leader type situation. Now, the battles you might expect to be on the sort of border between these two areas, and it wouldn't negate raiding further either side. So you might get battles deep inside one or other territory, but what I will argue is that the situation was far more nuanced to that, and you would have had, we've got evidence of quite a lot of continuation of land use and indigenous population in the east. There's no evidence for wide-scale killing off and pushing out of the indigenous population. And the amount of Germanic settlement is actually quite modest in some areas. So it's quite a nuanced picture. So the actual battles, when we go through them, most experts tend to suggest that they can't be located, but then they go on to accept that one or two can. And when you look at all the different experts, and you get consensus that actually some of the battles can indeed be located, and then you look at the evidence, linguistic evidence, you can be fairly confident that we can locate 6 or 7 of the battles roughly. Now, 6 or 7 out of 12 is a lot better than saying you can't locate any of them. And I would suggest that there's 1 or 2 others where we've got some fairly reasonable clues. But if we just go with the 6 or 7 we can be reasonably confident of, when you actually place them, they actually tell a story, because they're not where you expect them to be. 1 or 2 maybe, but others are far away from areas of earliest Germanic settlement and evidence of earliest Germanic material culture, and that tells a story. They're also quite spread apart, so we're not talking about a localised war hero. We're talking about someone who's operating across a wide area, and that would suggest there's some sort of polity surviving, some sort of authority that's in control of a large area, or at the very least surviving elements of the different provinces still working together. So what this leads me to suggest is something a little bit more radical than's been suggested before. I'm not going to spoil it, but I think it's quite a coherent theory about the site. I don't try and identify him as the actual person, but I think we can say quite a lot about what sort of person he was and what sort of world he lived in. He lived right on the cusp between the fragmenting Roman world and Roman institutions and the emergence of a warband culture and early petty kingdoms, both Anglo-Saxon and Britannic. And that in itself is quite interesting, hopefully. There's a chapter on warfare and weapons and contemporary battles, which hopefully brings it to life, what the battlefield of the 5th or 6th century would have been like. And I think it will be quite useful for anybody interested in that period, 5th or 6th century, the so-called Dark Ages, or anybody interested in Arthur will get something out of this book. So I hope you do like it. I shall put a link to Amazon and Pen and Sword in the blurb below. And thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.